memory or thought or whatever that's different from the manifest task that's been set out for you. Again, on the course website, there's a short version of the imaginal processes of a questionnaire called the Imaginal Processes Inventory, which was developed by Jerome Singer and John Antrobus to measure daydreaming activity in people. So the full version, which you don't have on the website, and you'll be glad you didn't, just about 300 items long, assessing every imaginable aspect of daydreaming activity. But it turns out that when you do the appropriate statistical analyses known as factor analyses, you find out that people's daydreaming activity can be classified along a relatively small number of dimensions. In fact, 3, what they call first positive constructive daydreaming, where you have a daydream and you get this really good idea, or you daydream and your thoughts are more pleasant than they were before, where the daydreaming itself enhances your life or enhances your performance in some way. Then second dimension is what's known as guilt and fear of failure daydreaming. I'm sure nobody in this room has ever had one of these. We're saying, oh, geez, I should have done things differently. And, oh, if only I had done this. And you kind of get swept away in those what-if daydreaming. In my fantasies, a friend discovers I have lied, or I imagine myself failing people. And then this third component, quite interesting, is not really daydreaming at all, but rather what Singer and Antrobus called poor attentional control. I'm the kind of person whose thoughts often wander. I find that I easily lose interest in things that I do. These are people who don't daydream because they like daydreaming. They don't daydream because they're neurotic and they can't help having these negative daydreams, guilty daydreams. But these are people who just can't seem to be able to focus at all. Now, this work was done before ADHD became quite prominent in the culture. And it would be interesting to know what the relationship is between attention deficit disorder, for example, and this dimension of poor attentional control. Here is an area where there actually has been some experimental research. I'll show you an early study. All of them look like this. This is work by John Antrobus, who's at City University of New York, who recruited subjects for a vigilance task. It was a 2-hour experiment. And what they're supposed to do is pay attention for a certain kind of event in the environment, and then press a button whenever it occurs. In fact, it was a tone of a particular pitch, and whenever they made a hit, that is, the tone was of that pitch, and they noticed it, they got a quarter or something like that just to kind of keep them going. Antrobus varied in the experiment what he called the information load. First, the rate of presentation of these tones, fast, slow, or somewhere in between. And second, the complexity of the stimulus, whether subjects are listening for just one tone out of 2, or one tone out of 3. And then every 15 seconds during this 2-hour period. Let me repeat that. Every 15 seconds during a 2-hour period, Antrobus interrupted the subject and said, "What are you thinking about?" Okay? It's kind of like the REM awakening study, except even more horrible. And it turned out that although subjects could do this task, their minds wandered off during the task with some frequency into various kinds of daydreams, or what, if you want to be really technical, right, you call task-unrelated intrusive thoughts, or tuits. So the next time you're with somebody and he kind of wanders off, just say, "Are you tuiting?" And you can look like a real scientific psychologist. Anyway, here are the basic results of this study. What we're looking at is the frequency of what they call here stimulus-independent mentations, or tuits, okay? With a slow or a fast rate of presentation, or a low or a high the cognitive load. And it turned out the less demanding the task, the more likely the person was to slip into some kind of daydreaming or to it. But if you look at this for a second, this is basically frequency per 15 seconds, even with a very high information load, very rapid presentation, lots of stimuli coming at you, the incidence of daydreaming was pretty frequent. So anyway, this is the kind of experimental study that's been done on daydreaming. More recently, an investigator named Stewarczyk has done a more thorough classification of these kinds of daydreaming into a 2x2 scheme in which he classifies his subject's thoughts as either stimulus dependent or not, or task related or not. So here you have stimulus dependent thoughts. That's being on task, doing what you're supposed to be doing, listening for that tone and pressing the button whenever you hear it. Stimulus independent, task related thoughts are interfering thoughts that are somehow related to the task you're supposed to be engaged in. I hate this task. This task is terrible. I wish I had never volunteered for this experiment. Those are stimulus independent. They've got nothing to do with what you're supposed to be doing, but they are at least task related. And then down here, you have stimulus dependent, task unrelated thoughts, where you're looking around the room and say, oh, that's a really interesting railing, or whatever. And then finally, your classic stimulus independent and task unrelated thoughts, where the person's mind is wandering. Again, we tend to use one of these vigilance tasks to allow people to enter into the daydreaming mode, and then see if we can catch them doing it. Related to this, Donald Broadbent, an English psychologist, the same Broadbent I talked about early on in the lectures on attention, has gotten interested in cognitive failures in normal people, not in people who are demented or anything like that. And he's developed a nice questionnaire that's also available on the course website, in which, again, he's found that absent-mindedness, which you can think of as a state of altered consciousness. When you're absent-minded, you're not paying attention to what you're supposed to be paying attention to. Comes in a couple of forms. Distractibility here, especially in social situations. You're at a party, you're talking to somebody else comes in the room, you turn your attention to them. Forgetfulness, especially forgetting what you're supposed to be doing. And then finally, what he calls false triggering, where you allow incidental events to interrupt your own experiences. So again, absorption, flow, daydreaming, absent-mindedness. These can be thought of as states of altered consciousness that happen to everybody on occasion in the ordinary course of everyday living without there being any particular, chemical agent involved. Jonathan Schooler has recently developed a nice paradigm for this, in which he gives his subjects an attention-demanding text to read. They're going to be tested on it later on, and then tries to catch people's mind wandering away from the text, either self-reported mind wanderings, or he'll interrupt them while they're supposed to be reading and see what they're thinking of. And one of his interesting observations in these experiments is that people are often unaware of the fact that their minds are wandering. That may seem a little paradoxical to you, but it happens in the following way. The subject will be reading the text, and the schooler will say, okay, what were you thinking about right now? And they're going to say, well, I was thinking about the text. You sure your mind wasn't wandering? No, I was thinking about the text. Well, what was the text you just read? And they can't tell you what the text was they just read. So under these circumstances, they're certainly not paying attention to the text, but they don't even seem to know that their mind has wandered as well. Now, it's entirely possible, this is another technical term, zoning out, that Schooler has adopted. What's interesting about this is the possibility that the subject's mind has wandered, but not into a daydream. The mind has wandered into kind of a void or a blank space where the person really is thinking about nothing at all. So there is what Schooler has called the kind of paradox of mind wandering, which is that subject has a task, and the mind isn't just wandering, he argues, but rather there is a shift in attention from the person's task to something else that he or she would rather be doing. But what's interesting about this is that Schooler has argued that under some circumstances, this shifting of attention happens unconsciously, inadvertently, and actually unnoticed by the subject, him or herself. So this is kind of the latest development in the study of daydreaming. I'm going to skip that because the literature on daydreaming and mind wandering and zoning out relates to an interesting, relatively recent trend in cognitive neuroscience and in brain imaging the studies. The discovery that there may be more than one way in which the brain operates. This is kind of a point made by Marcus Rakel, who was one of the early pioneers in brain imaging, who pointed out that for most of the 20th century, neuroscientists and other psychologists really embraced a single view of brain function, which was a view first put forth by Charles Sherrington in the early part of the 20th century, that the brain became active only when it was stimulated by an external stimulus. This is Sherrington's concept of the reflex activity of the brain, and his idea was that when there was no stimulation from the outside, the brain was simply in a quiescent state. But when a stimulus occurred, then the brain kind of woke up and started processing this stimulus. Rakel makes the point that this idea of the brain as reflex in many ways underlies modern brain imaging studies in cognitive neuroscience, because the way brain imaging is typically done is the subject is put in a magnet or put in a PET imaging device, and there's a control condition where the subject is just supposed to do nothing, and then there's an experimental condition where the subject is supposed to perform some kind of task. And what the brain image is of the brain becoming active in response to the stimulus or in response to various kinds of tasks. And you've all seen these brain images of the various parts of the brain becoming active in response to some kind of condition. And the essential methodology in this, whether you're doing PET imaging or fMRI or whatever, is that you kind of subtract out the baseline or the control activity. You basically treat it as noise or treat it as uninteresting or inconsequential.